let's take the agenda again. And this last session, this last round panel, is going to be dealing with systems approach and sector coupling. This is a very important topic because yesterday we had this 4 roundtable for 4 activities or areas or sectors. And if something is important when looking at climate change and systems transformation, is the systems view. So we need to avoid silos. Yeah? So we have been looking at technology in different silos, and now we have to put all these silos together to talk to each other and see what kind of opportunities can we tap in this system view. So the moderator for this panel was, or is intended to be Professor Sachs, but he's on his way. He might be like 10 or 15 minutes late. So what we are going to do is that I will be starting with the moderation of this panel, and later on when Professor Sachs arrives into the room, he will join us. So I would like to introduce the panelists. So we have Ms. Amal-Lee Amin, who is the Chief of Climate Change of the Inter-American Development Bank. So please, Amal, take your seat. Next, we have Megan Argiru, who is the Head of International Programs at Climate Work Australia. And last but not least, Mr. or Dr. Professor John Dernbach, who is Commonwealth Professor of Environmental Law and Sustainability at Widener University Commonwealth Law School. So thank you very much. Well, we will start the discussion. So the first speaker will be Amal-Lee. And we will leave her like 10, 12 minutes for her presentation. Then we will have another 2 presentations, and hopefully for the discussion, Professor Sachs will join. Thank you, Amal, please.
Thank you. Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to present on some work that we've been doing in Latin America and the Caribbean for the last 3 years now, pretty much, on getting to net zero emissions. This is work we've been collaborating very closely with the deep decarbonization pathways, and in fact we have created the DDP LAC, a community that is growing. We've been partnering with the Agence Française de Développement and also now the 2050 Pathways platform. So to hold the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5, how much do you think emissions need to be reduced? Anyone got any ideas? Is that 25%? 50%? 75%? 100%? Oh, no one was putting their hands up for any of those, but yes, it is actually 100%. And I suppose that's what the getting to net zero really is about, reducing CO2 emissions by 100%, as well as, well, greenhouse gas emissions, and potentially going to negative emissions too. So yeah, I think you're probably fairly familiar with these graphs. I won't talk through these in great detail, but as we know, the IPCC is showing how different greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 need to be reduced. And in fact, CO2 is probably the biggest, in terms of CO2, the biggest challenge in Latin America, like most regions, is transport and power and heat, industry and buildings. Of course, when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, then obviously land use sectors also are very important, particularly in some countries. So we know that a world with net zero emissions is technically possible, and we base that looking at 4 main pillars. First of all, decarbonize all electricity generation. Secondly, make a shift to electromobility, taking advantage of clean electricity. Also look at electrification of industrial processes and use of energy in buildings, residential sector as well. Look at also significantly improving public transportation, and in particular non-motorized form of transport. And last but not least, halting deforestation and increasing reforestation and other nature-based solutions. In addition to this, well, we also need to dramatically improve how we use resources across all sectors, reducing waste, increasing efficiency in the energy and the food sectors in particular, and switching to lower carbon diets, not low carb, lower carbon diets, and materials. So our study and our work with countries is also showing not only is it technically feasible, but a world with net zero emissions can actually bring economic benefits and opportunities instead of being a cost. So why is that? Well, we see the rapidly dropping costs of technologies such as renewable energy, batteries too. Batteries are plunging in price. We're seeing exponential reduction in costs. What we also know, and this is some work in particular that we have underway in Costa Rica, who is looking to shift to electromobility and improve public transportation, that actually when you look at, if you do a sort of more holistic cost-benefit analysis and you look at the avoided costs of congestion, and so increased productivity, as well as avoided costs of health impacts associated with air pollution, that there can be very significant increases in GDP through quality of life and competitivity benefits. And in Costa Rica, we estimate that at being as much as 3.8% of GDP. So what are the real challenges then to get there? Well, of course, it's really important to create the right policy, regulatory, enabling environment, as well as to help facilitate new business models that are needed to bring forward zero carbon solutions. As we see, however, in many countries, we don't have yet the right pricing signals. This graph just shows, in particular, how we see energy subsidies in many countries. That's the red bit. You can see other impacts in terms of local air pollution, congestion, etc., that takes place in countries in our region. The second challenge is what we refer to as the political economy. We know the transition can create winners, but also, of course, potential losers. This, for example, we've seen in the region, in fact, most recently in Ecuador, when there's a government that decides to either remove subsidies or potentially the announcement of shifting to electromobility. I think this was actually in Santiago when they were first introducing the electric buses. Then you see key businesses, the incumbents, trying to obviously block or oppose that transition. Another key issue is also what about the revenues, the fiscal revenues that are important for, of course, running of economies, and a lot of governments do get a lot of fiscal revenues from, for example, taxing gasoline, petroleum. So how do we manage that? Addressing and understanding those potential losses is really important to ensure that the economy obviously does not lose out overall. So when we think about the transition to get to net zero, and we are in 2020, if the aim is to get there by 2050, which it must be, in light of the Paris Agreement and, of course, the very significant impacts of climate we're already seeing, climate change. So if the idea is to get to net zero, we have to be ambitious. We need incremental change. We need transformational change, not incremental change, and we need to plan for that now. So if the idea is, if we were aiming towards, say, 20% as the main objective, you might build a house like this. But actually, aiming towards 100% reductions, we need to think of it figuratively as building something more like a tower, such as this. So what does that mean? Do you build the house on the left to get to the tower on the right? No, because if you do, then probably that house will become a stranded asset. So we need to create the foundations now to be able to get to the tower, in this case, to get to the most ambitious outcome in 2050. And I think this is probably one of the key findings of our research, and will be essential that decision makers really understand the implications here to ensure that not only to avoid stranded assets, but also the potential for stranded jobs. So when we look at the NDCs, we know they take a much shorter term horizon to 2025, 2030. Of course, next year countries will be, hopefully all countries will submit new, updated and more ambitious NDCs. So the long-term decarbonisation strategies that we're supporting countries with and developing, and Costa Rica is the country most advanced in our region, and we're actually now in the process of working with the government to help implement the decarbonisation plan that is based on their long-term 2050 strategy and vision. What we are seeing, the value of these strategies, is that the importance of establishing a clear vision of a carbon-free future and recognizing that that can bring and must bring prosperity. As I mentioned, when we look at shift to public transportation and electric mobility in particular, we'll see actually economic benefits associated with that over the time frame. Importantly, recognizing that some sectors will need to change dramatically, some types of technologies, particularly those associated with fossil fuels, will need to be phased out completely. It's really important to understand where those potential risks of stranded assets, but stranded jobs may come. We've been working with Chile and the Ministry of Energy in Chile and the International Labour Organization to look at the potential impact on workers in Chile through their commitment for phasing out coal. We actually see that there can be a net positive creation of jobs through the coal phase out. However, when we look at where the loss of jobs may be, they tend to be concentrated in just 2 communities. So really important to understand that and to then engage with and work with those communities to enable a transition in a way that doesn't significantly create negative impacts for those 2 communities in particular. As I mentioned with Costa Rica, I won't repeat this, I think I mentioned earlier on, but the cost-benefit analysis we're doing with Costa Rica is now going to help shape the new concessions that for the buses, for electric buses, that are due in 2021. So very timely, because these concessions last seven years. So more broadly, just to summarize what we as IDB are doing, we're helping countries through our NDC Invest platform to develop these decarbonization pathways. We're not developing the pathways on behalf of countries. We're training academic teams or think tanks in country, building a collaboration with other leading academic teams. We're strengthening the dialogue with policy decision makers and academia in country. And very importantly, strengthening regional collaboration and peer engagement on these pathways. So we see that the support of these long-term strategies, or the design of these long-term strategies, are really valuable in enabling countries to identify what their updated NDCs should now include, and hopefully build confidence of taking more ambition now in light of the benefits that will come in the medium and longer term. So not only supporting design, but of course the implementation of those. So thank you very much for your attention. I think I've stuck more or less in with the time, but just to summarize, this is the publication, it's online. This is a summary. There will be a fuller publication in 2020, but just to summarize, we see 3 long-term strategies as having roles in 3 main areas. 1, establishing that clear vision and identifying the opportunities, the social and economic opportunities that can be delivered in light of that vision. 2, anticipate costs and potential trade-offs. Anticipate those sufficiently far ahead so they can be effectively managed. And 3, work back from that long-term vision to identify what the medium-term goals should be and incorporate those into the updated NDCs next year. Okay.